whether it was said again today that Ernesto Laclau had passed away. I decided that since I owed him quite a considerable intellectual debt, I was going to go home and reframe my talk as much as possible, and I did. And if it's a little bit funny around the edges, it's I think blame my desire to do a little homage to Ernesto. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. One rarely hears this famous formula mentioned, except with approval. And I think that's remarkable for a formula that is mentioned a lot. When we pronounce these by now almost ritualized words, we feel that we are being properly tough-minded, but that we are simultaneously managing, as is our paradoxical duty, to maintain a hope which never looks very well-grounded or well-grounded enough, but without which we know nothing will ever be accomplished. Hope, in fact, is where the passage leads, a mere 2 sentences later, but I don't think the formula leads to a desirable conception of hope. That's because it refuses to pay attention to its grounding. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will is, of course, a slogan of the left, borrowed by the communist Antonio Gramsci from the fellow traveler and brave anti-war militant Romain Rolland. Perhaps for this reason, those who repeat the slogan seem unaware that, philosophically speaking, they're pledging themselves not to Marx or Hegel, but to Kant, to a Kantian sundering of will from intellect and of intellect from will. It was Kant who, in order to maintain the freedom of the will, was ready to separate it off absolutely from all calculation of worldly constraints and consequences. Each time we affirm that the will must be optimistic and the intellect pessimistic, we're agreeing with Kant that the will, in order to remain free, must turn its eyes away from the natural and social world in which it will be exercised. To put this differently, we are conspiring not to invite the will and the intellect to a social occasion where they might sit down together and have a conversation. A conversation in which they might provisionally choose which of the two stances, pessimism or optimism, is actually called for here and now under present circumstances. If conversation between the will and the intellect is off the table, the result, even on the left, which should know better, will be statements of the form, "There is always hope." That is a conception of hope as something that actual conditions, having been removed from the agenda, one must unconditionally favor. That's more or less how the Rolland quotation continues after the famous slogan to be. Doubt itself, Rolland concludes, the French "what do I know, que sais-je," becomes the weapon of hope, barring the road to discouragement and saying to his dreams of action and revolution, why not? When we say why not, pourquoi pas, what we mean, of course, is the opposite, that we do not want to hear any reasons why not, however good these reasons may be. We have made up our minds to action. We don't want to be dissuaded. End of story. But action, as such, is not always the right ending to the story. And if there is always hope, if it springs eternal, if while there's life there's hope, if, I will not go into Latin, one hopes as long as one breathes, then hope is not very strategic. It's actually pretty stupid, even annoyingly so. Hope becomes Emily Dickinson's thing with feathers that sings and never stops at all. I don't know about you, but I want to make it stop. You want hope at least to prove itself capable of tactical retreat in order to fight on some other better chosen day. You want it to husband its resources so as not to end in disappointment, burnout, and melancholy, as is all too often the case. It was the growing suspicion of the adverb always that cooled my youthful passion for Ernst Bloch's The Principle of Hope. In appearing so predictably accompanied by always, hope seems to encourage Tal al-Assad's rather stinging rebuke to the pious assumption that each and every collectivity is an active agent that authors its own history. To take an extreme example, he says to Marshall Salins, even the inmates of a concentration camp are able, in this sense, to live by their own cultural logic, but one may be forgiven for doubting that they are therefore making their own history. If hope is something that, like agency for Salins, you can't not have, even on your way into a gas chamber, or at any rate are under strict orders always to affirm, then it is too much like religious faith, a neighboring concept to be sure, but to my mind one from which it needs to be distinguished. As a latecomer to the discourse on hope, of which I discover there's quite a lot, I cannot claim that I have a secular conception of hope to offer, but this talk is meant as a step in that direction. The usual definitions of hope seem to include three elements: desire for something, the possibility of realizing that desire, and some degree of uncertainty as to whether one will realize it or not. The most interesting of these elements from the viewpoint of the left is uncertainty. Uncertainty can be minimized, the better to ground hope, or it can be maximized, so as to confer on hope the virtue of its ungroundedness. According to Nicholas H. Smith, the empirical tradition of Hobbes, Locke, and Hume uses reason to minimize uncertainty. It demands calculation of the likelihood of attaining the desired object. The religious tradition, on the other hand, coming out of Thomas Aquinas, tends, on the contrary, to emphasize the unknowability of the outcome and the inappropriateness of rational calculation. It's perhaps not a surprise that Kant and many others who are not thinking first and foremost of eternal life in heaven nevertheless agree with Aquinas that where hope is concerned, the calculating of probabilities is beside the point. According to Smith, I quote, "There's a view now quite widespread in the literature on hope, that hope should be separated from reason, calculation, and consideration of probability altogether. Some go so far as to say that hope is really hope only when this is the case. Those who espouse this view are often directed by the idea that we hope against hope, which they interpret to mean that hope, in spite of the evidence, in spite of probabilities, and in spite of reason, actually brings us to the essence of hope." That's the end of the quote. This category clearly includes a certain number of people on the deconstructive left or the messianic left. I think I chose the concept of hope when asked to pick a concept for this occasion, not really knowing very much about it, I'm afraid, so as to try to take the concept back from them. Given that a clear majority of our fellow Americans expresses hopes of immortal life and in the meantime expresses its faith that by pluck or luck they will eventually become the richest 5% of the population, and given that as educators we have a citizenly duty to educate, there is something to be said in favor of the severity of the empirical view. Why glorify uncertainty? Isn't it enough that we admit our lack of knowledge when, as so often, that lack of knowledge is unavoidable? Do we also have to get hotly defensive every time knowledge threatens to intrude into the vicinity of hope, a zone, hope cannot be the only example, that we've posited in advance as unknowable? In other words, posited as a sort of sacred ground where to know is to violate and profane. For the left, at any rate, it seems more suitable to begin not with maximal incertitude, but with maximal adversity, as Jonathan Lear does in his book Radical Hope. What might hope mean after the passing of the buffalo for the Crow Indians who faced the death of their way of life? Today, what might hope mean for the Palestinians of the occupied territories and Gaza, or for that matter, the Palestinians of the diaspora, and those who were second-class citizens in Israel, none of whom would benefit from the so-called two-state solution? If the concept of hope is not relevant to them, what is it good for? At the risk of sounding like Satan in the book of Job, making things grimmer and grimmer for Job so as to push his faith closer and closer to the breaking point, What should hope mean with regard to global justice? Global justice is the theme of an essay entitled Cosmopolitan Hope by Catriona McKinnon. McKinnon is one of the hopers against hope. The type of hope she cares about involves, I quote, refraining from judging the probability of an objective. The unlikelihood that the objective will be achieved is irrelevant. I quote, cosmopolitans can be, and often are, deeply pessimistic about the prospects for realizing the cosmopolitan ideal, and yet continue to hope for it. She illustrates her thinking with the story of a mother whose teenage daughter has been missing for 6 months, who retains hope that one day her daughter will return. This is all a quote. The mother does not think that the return of her daughter is probable, which is not to say that she thinks it is improbable either. Rather, she makes no judgments about its probability. Her failure to make probability judgments about her daughter's return does not prevent her from hoping for it. I note that this is an alienation story, looking forward to Akhil Bagrami this afternoon, and as such involves, one might say, neither creativity nor risk. It's really as if the mother can't help hoping, in part because she knows or thinks she knows, having her memories to fall back on, exactly what it will be like to have her daughter back at her side again. In order to hope, she does not think she needs to imagine something as yet unknown to her. This may have something to do, one speculates, with why her daughter left. You could laugh at that, but, then again, maybe not. But she would be the last person to consider that, since in refraining from all reflection on probabilities, she's also refraining from analysis as to why her daughter may have chosen to absent herself, and thus also from the sort of thinking that might help her discover where her daughter actually is. Calculating the probabilities of the daughter's return would lead back through the probabilities of how she disappeared and where she might be. In other words, it might mean doing something to get her back. McKinnon supplements her argument with another analogy. A person stands at the edge of a crevasse and is committed to continuing forward. In order to be able to jump across, she has to believe that she can make the jump successfully. And importantly, this belief alters the probability of making a successful jump. If she cannot talk herself into this state of belief, then her ability to make the jump will be impaired. If I have to choose between the global justice movement as a mother hoping for the return of her missing daughter, and the global justice movement as a woman jumping off a cliff, I suppose I would go for the woman jumping off the cliff. It doesn't have the creativity, but it does have the risk. Although even here the crevasse assumes solid ground on the other side, which is maybe not as much attention to the risk as the narrative calls for. Unless the fact that the reader is forced to accept the commitment to continuing forward as a premise that cannot be doubted, makes this commitment not in fact free at all. Considering how dire the unmentioned and unmentionable consequences would be of failure to jump all the way to the other side, we might then conclude that, like other hopers against hope, McKinnon is trying very hard not to look at probabilities she knows are there, but that she knows do not favor her cause, and therefore allows a certain pessimistic calculation of probabilities to hover over her argument like a dark cloud. Could a cosmopolitan hope ever allow itself to look the probabilities in the face? Like most cosmopolitanism of the old or universalistic sort, McKinnon's comes out of the Kantian tradition. I would like to try to imagine a Hegelian cosmopolitanism and a Hegelian hope. By this, I don't mean reaffirming the infamous cosmic optimism of a secularized Christian providence. Speaking without much expertise on Hegel, I'm afraid that's going to be obvious. But as an admiring amateur, I intend only to go along with what I take to be Hegel's basic premise, that intellect and will are interdependent, and that moral norms and commitments are historically produced, historically determined, and historically relative. It would seem to follow that cosmopolitanism, a term much more closely associated with Kant, could be reconceived not as a geographical translation of universality, but rather as a provisional aggregate of various sporadic expansions of ethics to larger scales, an ethical expansion beholden to and tainted by realities like commercial interconnectedness, the often coerced diasporic movements of peoples, developments in the technology of transportation and communication, and so on. My hypothesis is that this mode of grounding hope can be brought to bear on the calculation of probabilities for global justice, a goal that seems, on the contrary, tailor-made to induce hopelessness. Consider, then, some famous words that George F. Kennan wrote in Policy Planning Study 23, a confidential document circulated within the U.S. State Department in 1948 and published to the world at large only 3 decades later. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. That's the end of the quote. It seems noteworthy to me. Don't you know this quote? I thought everybody knew this quote. It seems noteworthy to me that Kennan's statement had to be kept secret, and when it was ultimately leaked, was considered scandalous. Why should it have been scandalous? After all, Kennan does not admit to theft. He does not say, as he might have, that our wealth depends on their deprivation. Yet his words were clearly perceived as embarrassing, and the embarrassment deserves to be thought of as a historical phenomenon in its own right, and to me an intriguing one. It implies the existence of an unarticulated cosmopolitan norm, recognizing that access to the world's resources ought to be better aligned with population, ought to be subject to something like global democracy, and not simply a matter of each nation trying to seize as much for itself as it can. If so, where did the norm come from? How did we arrive at this intimation of global justice? One place to look for this history, here I'm giving you a bit of a book that I think I'm in the process of writing, is in what I think of as commodity recognition scenes. Literary epiphanies in which some familiar consumer good is suddenly recognized as coming from a distant place of origin and from the labor, perhaps the coerced or otherwise unpleasant labor, of the distant inhabitants. The first such scenes I could find belong to a tradition in which a male moralist points the finger at a woman in the act of consuming a luxury. An example would be when Jonathan Swift's Gulliver observes, I quote, "This whole globe of earth must be 3 times gone round before one of our better female yahoos could get her breakfast or a cup to put it in." Swift fails to note that what's true for a female yahoo drinking her morning tea out of a porcelain teacup is equally true for yahoos who are male. They drink the same tea out of the same cups. Commodity recognition scenes emerge, it appears, only when they can target the supposed consumer excesses of women. In other words, they emerge by way of misogyny. And yet, here's a dialectical thought for you. A misogynist recognition of distant labor is better than no recognition of distant labor. Once the recognition is out there, it becomes possible for the misogyny to be subtracted, leaving something of value behind, as turned out to be the case. Blamed for their luxurious consumption, many 18th century women drew the conclusion that what they consumed was a political matter. and that it was a political matter precisely because it did connect their households to the distant labor of others, because it was a domain in which their apparently trivial actions made a global difference. Much of the distant labor, they realized, was performed by slaves. Logically enough, therefore, women took the lead in the sugar boycotts that accompanied the abolitionist campaigns of the late 18th century, aimed at cane sugar produced by slaves. The conditions of Caribbean labor lay right there before you, the campaign said, as close as your porcelain teacup. One Quaker pamphlet equated a pound of sugar with 2 ounces of a slave's flesh. To refuse sugar was therefore to strike a blow against slavery. The sugar boycotts of the 18th century are obviously not evidence of continuous linear progress. The recognition of distant labor in intimate domestic commodities was lost for some time, perhaps a casualty of the movement's success. The 19th century abolition of slavery allowed tea drinkers to rebrand the same brutal labor by the same workers on the same plantations as free, hence no longer a matter of scandal. But the recognition did not disappear. The anti-sweatshop movement that arose in the last decades of the late 20th century is an obvious and, I think, a notable descendant. I have a paragraph here that I think, in the interest of time, I will cut on an equally unlikely bit of historical evidence. This is the importance of the welfare state, which doesn't care about people beyond its own borders, and yet was necessary in order to demonstrate the feasibility of some democratic control of the market. Anyway, it's a step, trust me. There's more evidence of the sort that I could offer, none of it very conclusive. Another more recent example would be the Eat Local movement, which combines a certain, I think, clear anti-Chinese racism with a certain concern that the goods of the earth might be allocated more justly as well as more sustainably if we shipped and consumed fewer of them. But I'm obviously skipping evidence here to try to get to more general points. The racism that is mixed into the locavore fashion, like the misogyny that was mixed into the discovery of distant labor, makes it clear I'm not just saying that hope has to be grounded in history, that we need precedents. Of course we do. The Crow chief, whom Jonathan Lear reflects on in his book Radical Hope, produced hope, Lear says, when he gave the tribe the possibility of drawing on a traditional ideal that would help them endure a loss of concepts. In the narrative that Richard Rorty tells, history begins to replace God, reason, and nature as the source of human hope. Rorty is no blind worshipper of history. He defines hope as the ability to believe that the future will be unspecifiably different from and unspecifiably freer than the past. But like Lear, he wants a past that's full of ideals we can be proud of. What I'm trying to say is that history can be a basis for hope, even or especially when it's messy and unpleasant, when it's not filled with presentable ideals, when it offers us a past we cannot be proud of. This also means that history does not simply resist or stand as an obstacle to hope. It does that, and we want to say so. But unless we're intent on mystifying hope, pretending that it springs eternally from nowhere, surely we would also want to say that it is history that generates our hope. Here I am, no doubt, unwisely trying to out-Hegel Frederick Jameson, whose famous formula in The Political Unconscious was, history is what hurts. To talk only about history hurting, about how the Palestinians are being hurt, say, which of course they are, would mean forgetting the fact that as Israel's gross misconduct has little by little destroyed hopes for a two-state solution, it has unintentionally brought a one-state solution closer to the top of the agenda, where I, for one, had not expected to see it. That's not reason for confidence, but it's cause of hope. So, not just another world is possible, though it is, it's that another world is what you're going to get anyway, for better or worse. Let me try to make this case in another way. And I'm going to ask, all right. If you Google the word hope, not knowing much about it, I had to do this. Together with the name of some philosopher trying to nab a juicy quote about the concept of hope, what you mainly get, at least what I got, is commentators on those philosophers telling you what they hope to show or hope to argue about some entirely different, non-hope-related aspect of the philosopher's thinking. Someone should tell me how to avoid this research result. But, so I started thinking about I hope to show. I hope to show seems to me to offer a different concept of hope, a more active one, closer to waiting to than waiting for. I'm borrowing this from Arjuna Padarai's recent book, The Future as Cultural Fact, and in a sense, a better grounded sense of hope. While I was pursuing this thought, I came upon Jane Gallup's book, The Deaths of the Author. In that book, Gallup notices that our colleague Gayatri Spivak talks about her work as the author of a critique of post-colonial reason. She does so using the word progress, as in the sentence, "My book charts a practitioner's progress." Progress, Gallup goes on, does not seem like a word one would expect Spivak to use. She's here to say what she wants about it. The word progress generally denotes the most triumphant relation to temporality. Progress here represents the least troubled or troubling, the most positive version of a writer's change over time. That's Gallup. In fact, Gallup concludes, this somewhat conventional phrasing is quite atypical of the book. My book charts a progress, like I hope to show, inhabits a domain of meta-commentary that is perhaps more conventional than the domain of conceptual argument, or at least ruled by different conventions. Still, if we think of concepts as Adi Ophir has proposed as neither given nor invented, but rather as performed, then it follows that Gayatri can be given credit for her acknowledgement of progress, a term she knows very well would set off alarm bells. If we could admit to making progress with a piece of writing, admit to seeing progress happen at least intermittently in our institutions or our fields, admit to what Akhil Bilrami calls pockets of amelioration, then perhaps we should be able to learn from these admissions of achievement to acknowledge other kinds and scales of progress if and when we perceive them, even if they seem trivial. Just about right. In his 2012 New Left Review essay for a Left with No Future, the art historian T.J. Clark writes, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, not anymore." Because optimism is now a political tonality indissociable from the promises of consumption. Future exists only in the stock exchange plural. Hope is no longer given us for the sake of the hopeless. It has mutated into an endless political and economic microberism. If you don't recognize that, then read some Dickens. Susan Watkins responds, correctly, I think, that the no future position derives in large part from Clark's fidelity to a Weberian meta-narrative of modernity as rationalization and disenchantment, for her a serious mistake. Yet Clark's essay ends with its own tough-minded hopefulness, responding to the charge that his anti-utopian position is simply reformism. He replies, "The label does not scare me. Reform, it transpires, is a revolutionary demand." You can't stop me now, although I have one more page. This seems to me more or less what Ernesto Laclau said in a 2002 volume of interviews entitled Hope, New Philosophies for Change. You are in danger of losing hope if you imagine it, quote, in terms of the fulfillment of a perfect state of emancipation. But on the other hand, there is a proliferation of new hopes, new demands, and these demands can be put together to create some kind of more feasible social imaginary. This is not to say that our expectations are any less than in the past, but that at any moment in time we have to construct partial social imaginaries of transformation. The task of the left, he concludes, is to provide some more global notions of emancipation, but these notions have to be constructed around a particularized item. Ernesto Laclau's career-long engagement with populism will lead one to think that for him, as for Rorty, locating hope in the particular means locating it at the scale of the particular nation. Here, however, I think his particularized items can be aligned with what Clark calls reformism, and reform via particularized items becomes the means by which hope can be sustained at the global scale, hope in global emancipation. This point is much too important to raise in a final paragraph, but I have no choice. Whether hope should count as a political concept depends today on whether we believe politics exists at the scale beyond the nation, whether our social imaginaries include what Gramsci never quite got to call the international popular. Incertitude about the future is the common human condition, but it seems more important to stress that the incertitude is unevenly distributed, especially on a global scale. The same can be said of hope. Access to hope is unequal. Like precarity, it's a metric by which injustice demands to be measured. In order to fulfill our responsibility to see that hope is better distributed, we will also have to ensure it is better grounded. Maybe these are really the same operation. Thank you.
Just questions addressed to Bruce. Bruce, I wonder if it's worth exploring a kind of distinction that we might make about hope when we think of it for ourselves and we think of it for future generations, our children, for instance, that it might really be quite different. So, you know, if you read urban sociologists on migration, it's a pattern, a repeated pattern, that people migrate into cities and they're just much worse off in the cities. I mean, this is very widely acknowledged now by studies. They're much worse off in the cities than they were in the countryside. They never go back. There's almost no reverse migration. Or, you know, it's under very special circumstances explained by. And you know, there are of course diagnoses for this, and apart from the glamour of the city and so on, there's always in the interviews some claim that we know it's terrible for us, but we think for our children that the future is there. And even though we are sort of freezing in our own shit in the cities and the slums and so on, we really, so if you bring in the difference between hope for oneself and for future generations, there might be a certain amount of sacrifice built into the very notion of hope once you make it.
I have sympathy with the what I take as a critical approach to the notion of hope, but I think that it has to start with the effect that critique has on hope. And I have in mind, as a starting point, Rousseau's famous letter in response to Voltaire's poem on the earthquake in Lisbon. You are taking my hope, you are destroying my hope. And you can invoke some famous reactions to Kant's first critique. And you can remember the Marx critique of religion, etc., etc. So critique at the best case displaces hope, at the worst case just destroys hope, and tells us something about how hope is distributed, something that you. So I'm interested in the way you account for this. And finally, to both of you, if the past is really so multiple, can we hope for a different path?
One sentence, the question to Bruce is a quick one. Namely, the weak messianic. So I don't like Benjamin, and I agree that I don't like the left messianic. But after all, what Benjamin meant by it is that we must attend non-stop to the present. That is, it was actually an injunction to present attention. So it was a way of actually closing the gap between will and cognition, right? It was about attentiveness.
Akhil, I recognize completely the phenomenon you're talking about, sort of displacement of hope from ourselves to our children, which is very much a transnational phenomenon as well as a kind of urban-rural one. Just for the hell of it, because I didn't talk about climate change, I'm, as it seems necessary, the failure to make any of the present to make any sacrifice for the future. The fact that we do not seem to give a shit about our children, at least judging from our actions, is a huge phenomenon, you know, which, I mean, you'll say this actually might be a connection between the two papers. There's a lack of reciprocity, right? That, you know, we can do something for them, they can't do anything for us, therefore we won't do anything for them. It's weird, right? But it's, okay, about Adi, the effect that critique has on hope, also a facile reversal. There are people who would say that you can't actually have critique unless you have hope first, which again seems to me kind of important. And I think I'll stop when I'm ahead.
So I heard the two papers as being two variations on almost a singular theme and having the same politics, in the sense that you start with a dilemma: intellect, will, the past as fixed or the past as purely malleable. Then you disagree with this dilemma and you try to find something in the middle, kind of moderate, more prudent, something that reconciles them both. That it might be the case, but I don't accept these two binary distinctions for today. Today the problem is not the optimism of the will that is voluntarism or the pessimism of the intellect. Actually today we have an optimism of the intellect. We know that things are wrong. We know that this reality is unjust, this global neoliberal reality. We know these things. The problem is the will does not act. We don't have a will today. We don't have a political agency, subjectivity, however we want to call it. But rationally, it makes sense that this reality has to change. From any moral, political, ontological point of view, things are very wrong. We know that. So what we need is to rediscover the will, not to go against it, because the intellect is with us. So this is the first. The second question about the past, it's similar. The past, yes, it's conserved, but there is no really past. It's the past that exists, this global neoliberal, has 500 years. It's the present. The past that you want to say we can get fragment is really our present. There is no past and present. So what we need to do is to attack the present as it is, that will also deconstruct the past, and then we will see what we will do with it once we are able to have a rupture. But it's not that the past is a past. The past is here. It has been for five centuries. So maybe we have to start understanding reality in different ways and break with these old dilemmas, confront what is in front of us, and change the discourse. So this is my reaction.
Okay, Paul.
Well, I won't be able to follow that, but a much simpler version, I think, of the same question for Bruce, which is the question, what can we hope? What can one hope? What can we hope for ourselves or for our children? Can't just be a matter of, as I think I heard, unless I misheard something in the talk, a matter of drawing the right inferences or deductions from a set of facts. Assessing probabilities, I think was the way you put it. But moving in some way from facts to values. And I didn't hear an account of how we get from facts to values, facts to norms, and what you said. And particularly about what you called commodity recognition. It sounded more like just commodity identification. That tea in a porcelain cup as a commodity, but I didn't quite catch the move from that identification to then the value that we think global inequalities are worth changing or something like that. Without that kind of a move from fact to value, then I would just repeat everything Andreas just said. It leaves us helpless. We have all the intellect and none of the will.
Just a comment for Bruce. I just want to comment that optimism and hope are not the same. Optimism is actually, optimism is Voltaire. Optimism is preoccupying loss. It's some kind of belief in perfectibility. Hopefully something. And just about optimism, I might make it very quickly to tell a joke. It's a relevant joke, and it relates to climate change. The difference between a pessimist and an optimist. The pessimist says, really, things could not be good. And the optimist says, oh, yes, they could. But here's the question. My question is really the missing paragraph, which you rushed through about welfare state. I loved your example about misogyny and the idea that somehow we can find hope by subtracting something that's really unacceptable and finding something that survives. So there was this missing paragraph about the welfare state, which I wanted, and then your concluding comments about finding some sort of hope in some kind of international political activity. And what I wanted to know whether you think social democracy, welfare state, represents a source of hope in that international protest.
See, this appeals, and I think I'm with my brother here about contextualization. I think Akil made a very fantastic point about children and really writing. Sibiak showed me, when he was alive obviously, a whole collection of signs that they had made for the people who were going to be back in the world after a nuclear holocaust. Now that is, I couldn't for the life of me understand any of those signs, but I would have perished by then. So that's writing for the philosophers of the future, right? And that can be contextualized. Nigeria, for example, all of the grant-giving institutions monolithize Africa, right? And Nigeria is one of the worst places for this urban thing. Monstrous cities. Lagos, you cannot imagine it. Now, why does this happen? Someone is just coming from Harvard with money to do post-harvest spoilage. There is no post-harvest spoilage in Nigeria because since oil, there's no primary production in Nigeria. Our student, Lexi Smith, is with, Lexi Cook, is with a group now who are trying to bring back capital into, that's why I was talking about development as insertion into capital. It can be good, bad. Trying to bring back capital into the rural area, and that people can go back and also stop the fact that all the starches are coming from subsidized US agriculture. So that there is a way of contextually turning back this kind of hope for our children, but it has to be more than talk. So I'm very much with you. And as for your Dane's idea about progress, now that was 1999. In the current book, once again, I speak on behalf of the deconstructive left, okay? All of them. So they wouldn't perhaps, okay. So what I say in the current book is this. I work in the absolute conviction, see, progress, conviction, these are bad words, but they're quite deconstructive. I speak in the conviction that the only way that a democratic future can work is in the persistent training of an educated, not just informed, educated electorate, right? That's work. Okay, now this work, I can even say that I've given my life to it. Now, in this sense, I say in the book, I have no hope that this is going to happen. No hope that this is going to happen. But I cannot not write my conviction. So that that is a situation which is a rewriting of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. I'm reminded of Sibiak, that there will be, of course, my writing unfortunately will not last, but one can only write in the hope that it might. So therefore this writing for the philosophers of the future, rather than the facile use by every Derridian fundamentalist of the phrase to come today. There is a little group. That's not where it's at. So that's the whole thing that I wanted to say. Okay, one is about history, the longue durée as acid reflux, and the other was the idea of contextualizing the rewriting of hope for the future and writing for the philosophers of the future, a la Sibyok. Sorry, couldn't make it any shorter.
No, there are no more questions.
No.
The audience, and it's about you guys. Well, there is
Right.
an absolute.
I have many things to say, but maybe not right now.
Over lunch.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.